My name is Michele, and I have a very different story to share. You can be the judge if it was extraterrestrial or not, but in my opinion, I feel like somehow it was. In 2017, I was 26 years old and in my first apartment. One of the things I always made time for after leaving my parents' house was going out to dinner with my dad, because we've always been really close and made it a point to get together about once a month. It really didn't matter if it was a nice restaurant or a foot-long from Subway. It was just something we both wanted to do. One night after we'd had dinner at our favorite Mexican restaurant, he was driving me back to my apartment and said something in the car that caught me totally off guard. We were only a few minutes away from where I lived when he asked if he could share something with me that I might find a little unusual. Of course I said yes. Then he made me promise not to think he was going crazy and admitted that lately he had been seeing things above the house at night. I could tell he was serious about it and asked him to elaborate. He told me that over the past few weeks he had been seeing little clusters of lights in the sky. It wasn't happening every night, but he had seen them 5 or 6 times in total, and being a night owl, it was always late and after my mom had gone to bed. He described them as tiny points of light that would move in patterns together, and they were always above the house. He's a very grounded person, and I could tell it was a hard thing for him to talk about. I tried to stay rational and told him that what he was seeing had to have a normal explanation. We only stayed on the subject for a minute and then he dropped me off. This happened to be on a Sunday night, and since I had to work in the morning, I went to bed shortly after getting home, and the second I fell asleep, I had this incredibly clear and real dream about him. This is how that dream went. I was walking through a huge hilly field with my dad. It was at night and there were tall grasses everywhere around us. The stars were out in full force, like where you can see part of the Milky Way going across the sky, and we were walking next to each other and talking just like we would in real life. Other than the location, it felt totally normal. Then, straight above us, there were clusters of lights moving around, and we watched them change directions and break apart, then come together again. It looked like it had been choreographed. We both stopped walking to watch, and he told me that these were the lights he was telling me about. I was amazed at how beautiful they were and how strange, but visually it was incredible. Then they started to slowly drop down closer to us, and they got bigger and brighter, like they were falling right into the field. At the same time this was happening, I looked over at my dad and he told me he had to go. I didn't really understand any part of what was going on, but as soon as he said that to me, one of the lights broke away from the group, came straight down and hit the ground in front of us. It was so bright I remember covering my eyes with my hands, and when I opened them again, my dad was gone. The dream ended with me standing in the field totally alone, and I had this deep feeling of emptiness and loss. It actually brought me to tears, and that's what woke me up. When I got up, I looked at the clock and still had about 2 hours left before my alarm would go off, but there was no chance I could get back to sleep after a dream like that, so I got up and put the news on until I left for work. This was one of those dreams that stays with you for the whole day, and that's exactly what happened. It also gave me a nagging feeling to call my dad, so I ended up calling him when I got home that night. Our conversation went like it always did, but then I had to tell him about the dream I'd had. I wasn't even past telling him we were walking in a field together when he stopped me and said he couldn't believe what I was saying. Apparently, that same night, he'd had a very similar dream about me. We weren't in a field in his dream, but we were together and watching the same lights in the sky. As if having the same dream about each other wasn't crazy enough, he had also seen one of the lights fall to the ground in front of us, but his dream ended there, whereas mine kept going a little while longer when I was alone in the field. He told me it made him want to call me, but he didn't want to bother me on a workday. We were both a little dumbfounded that something like this was possible, and it's hard to describe how it made me feel. We didn't know what to think about it, and at the time we decided it must have been from what he had said in the car and the close father-daughter connection we've always had. There really wasn't another explanation that we could come up with, but we did agree it was something special. Not another word was said about it for months afterward. Then my dad picked me up from work one day for lunch, and while we were at the table waiting for our food, he brought it up again, totally out of the blue. He said that he had seen more lights again over their house. It had only been one time, but they were exactly the same as before, and then he made a comment about feeling connected to them mentally and physically, which actually concerned me a little. He made it sound like they were specifically there for him, and it had me slightly worried about his mental well-being because he was very serious. It was definitely unexpected, and we talked about it for a little bit while we ate lunch, but I didn't have the time to dig deeper since I had to get back to work. Looking back though, I wish I would have called out and spent the rest of the day with him because I could tell he wanted to talk, and I just got this feeling he wanted to spend more time with me. This is the difficult part of my story. Not even 2 weeks after we had had lunch, I got a call from my brother at 5 o'clock in the morning. It was so early that I almost knew something was wrong before I answered the phone. I will never forget hearing his shaking voice on the other end telling me our dad had just had a massive heart attack in the middle of the night. There were no warning signs, and even though he avoided doctors outside of an emergency, he was healthy and had no previous issues that anyone was aware of. That was March 7th, 2018, the day my dad passed away. I'm sure a lot of people can relate to this, but words don't exist that can describe what this did to me. I've never been closer to another human being in my life, and just like that, I didn't have him anymore. After the horrible initial period of shock and grief, I started to deeply think about what had happened leading up to my dad's passing. I was going over it hundreds of times in my head at work and at night and everywhere else. I couldn't stop wondering if the lights he had been seeing were some kind of sign from the afterlife or if they were something totally different. He said they were actual real things in the sky, and he had been wide awake every time he saw them, so I have to think it was something in the physical world. I'm just not really sure how I feel about that. The most unbelievable part of it, though, was the dream we'd had together. The entire thing seemed to be centered around those clusters of light, and it makes me emotional every time I think about it because I can't figure out what they were or what it all meant, especially since my dream had ended with him gone and me standing alone in a field. I've had some years to process this, and I feel like something out there was watching my dad and possibly in contact with him in some kind of way, and I believe he knew it. I also think that whatever this was somehow knew it was the end of his time here on Earth, and they gave me a glimpse of that in my dream. I'll say it again, I don't know if this was related to life or entities outside of our planet and our understanding, but I feel like it was. My dad experienced something very strange and he felt connected to it at the end. I also know that it really affected him or he wouldn't have told me about it, and I guess I just wish I knew what it was. I live in Missoula, Montana, and my parents are up in Sandpoint, Idaho, which is where I lived for half my life. I've made the drive up there for years to visit them and for all the major holidays, so it's a very familiar route to me. Normally it takes me about 3.5 hours if I don't stop, and I feel like I could just about do it with my eyes closed. This happened on a Thursday night when I was going up to see them over a 3-day weekend. I had worked that day and clocked out at 5:30 p.m. Then I drove home to grab my bag and eat something before leaving. I left my house at 7 o'clock Missoula time or Mountain Time, which should have put me at my parents' house right around 9:30 Pacific, which is the time zone Sandpoint is in. The first part of the drive was normal and boring. Traffic was light leaving Missoula because it was later on a Thursday, and once I got out of town it was wide open. I had my road trip playlist going and a hydro flask full of coffee, and it was just another drive to Sandpoint. The trip was completely uneventful until I got to Knoxon Reservoir. After going over the bridge, I was on a part of the highway that runs right next to the reservoir. That was where I first saw a flash of light out of the corner of my eye. It was outside and on my left, and it happened so fast that I barely reacted the first time. I didn't think it was anything more than a reflection from something because when I looked out the window it was dark and there was nothing there. 20 to 30 seconds after the first time I saw it again, and it was another quick streak of light in my peripheral vision on the left side. I turned my head, but I didn't see anything that time either. There's really only trees down both sides of the highway there with intermittent views of the reservoir. There was no one behind me, so I knew it wasn't headlights in my side mirror, but it still kept happening. Over the next 5 miles or so, it probably happened 10 more times, and every one of them was the same quick flash that I could only catch out of the corner of my eye. It also seemed like no matter how quickly I would turn my head to look at it, I could never see what was causing it. There was absolutely nothing around. The only thing I noticed was that a couple of the flashes were brighter than others. That actually bothered me a little because the brighter ones looked like they were going along with my car at the same speed, and I started to think there was something in the trees or over the water. This kept happening and I started getting a little too focused on it. I found myself waiting for the next flash so I could try to see it directly, and I realized I was looking out the side window more than I was actually watching the road. I ended up drifting into the oncoming lane because I was staring for so long, and that startled me back to paying attention. But even after that happened, I kept my eyes locked on the trees in front of me. I must have spent 10 frustrating minutes ultra focused on the trees trying to see what was making this happen. Then something else got my attention and I almost couldn't believe what I was seeing. I drove past the little rock sign on the right side of the road that welcomes you to the town of Kootenai. Seeing this took me a few seconds to even process, then it all hit me at once. Kootenai is basically right next to Sand Point. It's literally 5 minutes from my parents' house. I immediately looked at the clock and it said 8:38 p.m., which was physically impossible. I shouldn't have been anywhere near Kootenai for another hour. I know the time zones might make this a little confusing, but I was essentially coming into town a full hour early. This was so disorienting I had to stop the car and I pulled into a Conoco gas station to figure out what was going on. I was right on the edge of freaking out and thought it had to be an issue with my phone switching time zones, but it wasn't. While I was in my car at the gas station, the clock on my phone was showing 8:40. Then the clock on my dashboard was exactly an hour later at 9:40. Theoretically, they were both correct. Somehow I had made a 3.5-hour drive in 2.5 hours, which flat out wasn't possible. I stayed in the parking lot trying to dissect this. I knew for a fact I had left my house at 7 o'clock, so no matter how I tried to spin it, there was no way I should have been in Kootenai. It was like I had gone through a rip in time and bypassed an hour of the drive. The scariest part about it was that from my perspective, I had just been driving past Knoxon Reservoir, and within minutes I was coming into Kootenai. Those two places are an hour from each other, and I had no memory of driving between them. I couldn't even sit in my car and I had to go into the gas station store to walk around and mentally regroup. It put me into a daze actually because my anxiety was higher than it's ever been. I bought a bottle of water while I was in there, and even though I didn't want to, I asked the guy at the counter if he knew what time it was. His clock in the store matched the time on my phone, and that was a third confirmation. I drove the last few minutes to my parents' house and tried to act normal when I got there, but it had scared me so much I ended up having a small breakdown in the living room, and I had to try and explain this impossible situation that had just happened. My mom sat with me while my dad kept saying I must have left earlier than I thought. He was sure I was just mixing up the time I saw on my way out the door. Both of my parents were telling me it was a simple mistake. The problem with their explanation, though, was that it was still mathematically wrong. It was a stone-cold fact that I had clocked out and left work at 5:30. Then I went all the way home and did all that stuff before leaving, like packing my bag and eating. There is no way I got out of there before 7 o'clock, and it was like they weren't even listening to the part about seeing flashes and streaks of light out my window at the reservoir and having no memory of driving between there and Kootenai. That is still the scariest part for me. I had been so focused on figuring out what I was seeing that I wasn't paying much attention to the road ahead of me. Then it was like I actually broke the laws of physics and teleported 50 miles ahead. After second-guessing myself all weekend, I made it a point to check the actual time I had clocked out of work on Thursday. I needed absolute proof that it was in fact 5:30, and when I checked my computer at work, I was right. That was the exact time I left. I knew I was right about that anyway because that's when we close, and I couldn't have possibly left an hour early on accident. I am now convinced that I had an episode of lost time and it happened when I was next to the reservoir. The strange thing is, I have found plenty of other stories about people losing time, but every one of them has been a negative loss, like they will lose several hours without any memory of it, and it's suddenly much later. Mine was the opposite of that, where I had some kind of positive loss, or I gained an hour without any memory of it, which doesn't make any sense. I feel like I was pushed into the future. I've yet to come up with any plausible scenarios that could explain what happened to me. Whether my experience was extraterrestrial or paranormal or even a glitch in the Matrix, who knows? But something happened to me that shouldn't be possible, and it felt like I lost time in reverse. This happened in the tiny town of Umatilla, Florida, where I grew up in the 80s. One year when I was a kid, it was Easter weekend and a bunch of our family came down from Akron, Ohio to spend the holiday with us. My grandparents came along with my uncles and aunts and two of my older cousins. It was a full house and we just spent the weekend doing normal family stuff like eating and sitting around talking. One of the people there was my Uncle Terry, who's my dad's brother. Back then, I used to think Terry was the coolest guy in our family because he was taller than everyone else and he had a lot more money than we did. He always seemed to have the newest, nicest things and he exclusively drove Cadillacs. That weekend, he had brought an RC car with him and I remember being so excited about it I could barely contain myself because I had never gotten to play with one. On Easter night, we had just finished dinner and everyone was sitting out back. It was the time at night where the sun had gone down, but there was still a little light left in the sky. I was in my room and my Uncle Terry walked in and asked if I wanted to go outside and drive the RC car. I immediately ran out of my room and we walked to his car together, which was parked on the street in front of our house. I remember standing right next to him and looking in the trunk while he got the car and the remote ready. At that same time, we both looked up because there was something in the cloud directly above us. That night, there happened to be a lower layer of cumulus clouds and above that was a second flat cloud layer. What we were seeing was a bright blue light moving in between these two layers and it was really visible on the bottom of the cumulus cloud. This blue light was bright enough to get anyone's attention and we could see it moving around all over the place in the cloud right above us. It was making the inside of it light up and we could even see that blue color reflecting on the upper cloud layer. It just wasn't as bright. The way it was moving was random too, like someone was controlling it but without any kind of route or path. There was also no blinking and we never saw it go in a straight line. It was just bouncing around and constantly changing direction. I had never seen anything like it. I stood there and watched this with Terry and definitely thought it was interesting, but I didn't care that much or think about what it could be. All I wanted to do was drive the car around. What stands out in my memory though was how serious my uncle was while he was looking at it. He was staring intensely like he was trying to figure out what it was. Then without even looking back down, he told me to go in the house and get my dad right away, and I could tell from the way he said it, he meant do it now. I did what he asked and started running toward the house, and I clearly remember him yelling to me to turn the front lights off because they were bright and it was making it harder to watch this thing. On my way through the front door, I flipped the outside lights off. Then I went through the house and out the back door where the rest of my family was. Everyone back there was talking and laughing, and I told my dad that Terry needed him out front right away. No one else really reacted or even heard me, but my dad got up and followed me back through the house. When I opened the front door and went outside, there was no one there. The yard and the street were empty and my Uncle Terry was gone. His car was on the street exactly where it had been when I left, and the trunk was still open with the RC car sitting inside. I told my dad that he had just been there standing at the car, then told him about what we had seen, and I remember describing it as a weird blue plane. We both kind of scanned across the sky and also looked around the sides of our house for Terry, but we didn't see anything. Then my dad walked out toward the end of the block calling Terry's name a couple of times, but he didn't answer. I think we were out there for a few minutes, but we didn't see him anywhere, so my dad went back to his car and waited there for a little longer. He didn't seem worried about it because he started playing with the RC car in the trunk. I'm guessing he was mostly confused as to why Terry would have walked off and left the trunk open like that. After some time, my dad was ready to go back in and said something about Terry possibly being in the house or going into the backyard without us knowing, so I just followed him. When we got inside, other people must have known something was up because they were asking where Terry went. My dad let them know that we couldn't find him, then he did a quick check of the house and our downstairs bathroom. I went out to the backyard just in case, but he wasn't there. At that point, my uncle had been gone for probably 25 or 30 minutes. I stood with my dad and my other uncle in the kitchen waiting to see if he was going to show up, and the rest of the family was still going about their business and talking like normal. There really didn't seem to be any panic about it. After a while, my dad said he was going to check Terry's car again, so I went with him. As soon as he opened the front door, there was Terry, and he was standing at the trunk of his car with the RC car in his hands. I followed my dad out to the street and I heard him ask Terry where he had been. Then Terry told him he hadn't gone anywhere. The only thing he said is that he had been getting the RC car ready. I know he and my dad talked about it for a minute, but I honestly don't remember what was said. They were both calm and didn't seem concerned about anything, and my dad eventually went back in the house, which left Terry and me standing out front again, and I really had no idea what had just happened. He didn't even say anything, then went to the middle of the street and started driving the car around. He called me over, and while he was showing me how to use the remote, I finally said something about him being gone for so long. I got the same answer he gave my dad, that he hadn't gone anywhere and had just been waiting at the car for me to come back out. I didn't know how to respond, and I couldn't understand why he was lying about disappearing for a half hour. I didn't want to argue or tell him he was wrong, so I kept my mouth shut after that. We drove the car up and down the street until the battery was dead, and nothing else happened during that time. When we were back at his car and putting it away, the light in his trunk was on so I could clearly see his arms and hands, and that was when I saw something on the top of his hand. Right in the center of it, there was a big circle that looked exactly like a fresh burn. His skin was all red and swollen, and it looked like it had just happened. Then in the middle of this burn, there was also a raised white spot that looked like a blister was forming. It was very noticeable, and it was the first thing I saw when he put his hands in the light. What made this so concerning was that I knew it hadn't been there before that night. It's not like I was paying attention to his hands or anything, but we had been together for days, and there's no way I could have missed it. Our family stayed for one more day after this, then everyone drove back up to Ohio. I did notice that my uncle had 2 band-aids across the top of his hand that last day, but I don't remember anyone saying a word about it. As I got older, I never forgot what happened that weekend. I've gone over the details as I remember them with my dad, and while he knows we did actually look for Terry, he's never acted like it was anything. He just says Terry must have walked off somewhere then come back like it was no big deal. I've even asked him to be straight with me, thinking maybe Terry was off doing something I was too young to know about back then, like the possible use of illegal substances, but he says Terry has never been into anything like that, and he can promise me that's not what it was. The problem I have now is that I know I saw something in the clouds above us, and Terry saw it too. And I don't get that because he was the one who got all serious and told me to get my dad. Then he disappeared for half an hour and acted like he was there the whole time. None of it makes any sense. This story has confused me since it happened, and when I look back, it reminds me of some of the sighting and abduction stories I've heard and seen on TV over the years. It's not so much about what we saw in the clouds either. It's the fact that Terry vanished into thin air, only to show up again and act like he wasn't even gone. And the mark he had on the top of his hand was no joke. That thing was gnarly, and it seemed to just magically appear after he had come back. My Uncle Terry still lives in Ohio. He's retired now and doing fine, but I rarely see him anymore. I think the last time was 5 or 6 years ago at Christmas. I've never brought it up to him a second time, and mostly I keep this whole experience to myself. It's now just this thing that happened when I was a kid that I can't explain. I want to thank everyone for watching another episode of Skywatcher Stories. If you like hearing these personal experiences of strange sightings and alien encounters, please subscribe because I upload new episodes every week and it really helps the channel. Until next time, keep watching the skies.